Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Thanks for joining this webinar, Tips for Better Collaboration with Your Hiring Manager. Before we get started, we're going to go over some housekeeping tips. You can connect to audio using your computer's microphone and speakers by selecting Computer Audio, or opt in to dial in by using your phone by selecting Phone Call. All lines are muted to avoid background noise, but be sure to submit any questions you might have in the question pane. We'll be answering all questions at the conclusion of the webinar. Additionally, as a reminder, you will receive a recording and slides at the conclusion of the webinar. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our two guests, Elizabeth Giamona, who will be speaking on behalf of Entelo, and Scott Lee. Welcome.
Hi, Scott. Thanks so much for joining us today. With a team, having led a team that's managed so many hires, I know that's a lot of relationships with hiring managers that you've had to build and maintain. So I can't wait to hear your perspective and best practices. How many hiring managers would you say you've worked with over the years?
Gosh, that's a good question. At Uber, I think it depends on the level at which you're strategizing with your hiring manager. But when you look at the CTO all the way down to first line managers that are responsible for building their respective teams in a given year, I'd say at Uber that's probably 4 or 5 dozen.
Wow, that's amazing. That's awesome to hear that we have somebody with that much experience speaking with us today. So just to go over what we're going to be talking about today, it's really about making sure that we're building those relationships with a strong start and getting those hiring manager relationships off on the right foot, and then that we're continuing to build and maintain the collaborative approach throughout the process. And making sure that there's transparency. We know that when it comes to people, there's always going to be the unexpected. So making sure that there's a lot of transparency to help maintain that relationship when things do come up that weren't necessarily predictable at the outcome. We know how important data is to back up our ideas and claims, so leveraging data to build credibility and maintain trust with the hiring manager. And really up-leveling the relationship. So there's so many opportunities where in recruiting you can really provide value as a talent consultant. So what are some ways that we can do that? And then using the candidate experience to show the successful partnership between the hiring manager and the recruiting team. So the outcome that, of course, we all want is getting the right people in the roles that we have available and making sure that a great candidate experience allows us to close on the candidates that we know will really contribute a lot to the organization. If that sounds good, we'll go ahead and jump in with the first tip, which is building accountability from the first intake meeting. So Scott, I know that you and your team probably have a lot of these any given week, probably any given day. And I know that some of the most important components are just setting expectations. So for both the hiring manager and the recruiter, just being really open about what the expectations are. It could be a role that you're filling constantly, a role that comes up a lot, or it could be a role that's sort of that purple unicorn and you don't know exactly how long it'll take, but what are the expectations from both sides? And then continuing the conversation and making sure that there's an action plan so that you can continue to collaborate. And looking down the road, it might be a role that you already have some great internal referrals for, or it could be a role that your company's opening for the first time and there's a lot of stakeholders involved. So using this first intake meeting to really look at what the expectations are. So Scott, what are some ways that you've had successful first intake meetings, and what do you like to ask?
Yeah, I think, when we talk about in the context of Uber, we're talking about some pretty massive scale, right? So when you're meeting with an organizational leader, generally you're in a position where you're asked to kind of fix a hiring process or basically scale out a team from say 0 to sometimes 150, 200, 300 in a very short amount of time. And to get to those hiring goals, like, first you want to align with your hiring manager to understand what hasn't gone well and where the gaps are between what's expected versus what's being delivered. Now that seems pretty elementary. I would say most competent recruiters are taking that step. The big thing that you do in that is once you kind of align that, what I love to do, and I've done this a few times, is we build a simple burn down chart, right? Based off of the information you're telling me and what these demands are to get to the end of the year, we need to hire this much, right? And this much will relate to this amount of offers, this amount of on-sites, this amount of phone screens, broken down by what those various needs are, so that we could build a plan towards something that, hey, this is what success looks like. This is what our North Star looks like at the end of the year, right? Ultimately, it gives us both a very, very absolute truth frame of reference that we can go back to partner together when things aren't going well, right? When we're not hitting the right numbers we need to hit, when we're not bringing in the right volume, or maybe on the other hand, maybe we're not closing at the rate that we should be closing at.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, and that leads into the next item, which is the accountability portion. And I think that when you have set those milestones and being able to leverage that to help with your accountability, and that you're having these meetings on a regular cadence to really talk about where were the expectations, what might be helping contribute to meeting those, or what might not be, and being really open about the roadblocks, because I think there's always going to be challenges when you're going into a recruiting process, especially with a hiring manager that maybe you haven't worked with before. So using that transparency to help with the accountability, I think, is really critical.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that. And I've talked to a number of recruiters at different startups, and I think the struggle is the same across the board. Which they'll say, Scott, I wish our hiring managers would trust us, would allow us to be the consultants and the experts we are to drive the hires through. And I actually vehemently disagree with that. I think that we should be consultants and we should be trusted. But the first step to get there is to gain that trust, is to gain that level of accountability from your hiring managers. So, even after the first intake, when you build a plan, that plan needs to be followed through with reliability. There was a hiring manager who's been here for about 5 years at Uber now. One of our most successful directors. I took over recruiting for about 2 years ago. And when my team took over, that hiring manager had not made a hire for 6 months. We're talking about hiring goals in the hundreds here, and he hadn't made a hire for 6 months. And he said, you know what, Scott, the plans are always the same. The complaints are always the same. The roadblocks are always the same, but no one seems to deliver, right? And so when we came in, we didn't do anything new. We had the same intakes, we had the same plans, and we had the same charts, and we had the same burn down that we've been having for every single client we have here at Uber. What we applied above that was just a layer of accountability on being very, very transparent on, hey, these are things that we're doing, and hey, also, by the way, these are things that are going wrong in real time. Right? These are when we're seeing dips in interested response rates. These are when we're seeing dips in, interviewers not honoring their on-site requests, when we don't have enough interviewer capacity. This is where we're seeing gaps in the closing process. And then here are the solutions that we would provide for that. And ultimately, when you get in that cadence of being transparent and providing the solutions, that builds the trust to the ultimate goal that we want to get to, which is the hiring manager not saying, hey, do this, but hey, what can I do? How can I help?
Exactly. And I think that's so important when, as a recruiting team, you're really playing that more consultative role, and putting on the consultant hat so that you're providing feedback and guidance in a more broad way. So it's not just about how are we filling this role right now, but looking at the bigger picture and providing your input and expertise so that they really see you as a partner, rather than just as a service provider.
Definitely agreed.
And I think that leads really well into our next tip, which is getting buy-in from your hiring manager. And I think that, big picture, hiring managers want to find the best person for their team, but we know in the day-to-day, they're so busy, especially if they're actually doing the role that they're trying to hire for while they're waiting for that perfect candidate to come in and then join the company, that they're super busy and they have a million different things going on. And even though they really want to get this role filled, just the day-to-day can really come up. And make it harder for them to devote the time that they need to. So building the relationship is so important so that they trust you to move on things without needing a lot of back and forth. And I
Yeah.
think that leveraging data is super important here. And I know that this is something that you've been able to do and add to your team so that the team knows what's working and what isn't. So I'd love to hear some of what you've done in that area to make sure that you're having that buy-in as a result of building off of data points.
Yeah, and one thing I think we'll notice with these tips is these are things we all build on each other. So we can't really get to the point where we have buy-in from our hiring manager and actually present data until we've done the first thing, right? Until we've actually built accountability and we've done the intake and we've shown, hey, this person's trustworthy, right? This is a recruiter that I can really partner with, right? And once we get to that point, I think one of the biggest things that we need to do, we need to remember when giving our hiring managers data is to know our audience, right? What is really, really important for someone is not very important to someone else. The example I always want to give is reach out statistics, right? How many candidates we're reaching out to? What are the response rates? How many of them are coming into process? Well, in my last scenario, if you're working with a hiring manager that has gargantuan hiring needs, and for the most part, they're probably hiring a lot of the same thing over and over and over again. Well, those pipeline statistics are really, really important. And what you probably don't need to do in that case is you don't need to have a line item by line item review of every single candidate process, right? Now, if you flip that upside down, I want to give a shout out to him, and I was told he's on this webinar, but one of my favorite people I've ever worked with is a fellow by the name of CJ Wilson. And we tasked CJ with a very, very specific need, right? He was tasked to build out our AI labs here at Uber. And that was a very, very unique profile. That was something that didn't exist in most of our, incumbent competitors like Google or Facebook at the time. And it was something that was truly moonshot, something that was truly going to drive the future of our company, right? And because of that, because of the nuanced need there, because every single profile we would send in had a very, very strategic purpose, that's when we went line by line. Right? And by going line by line, what we showed what the available market was. We showed that it was incredibly small and niche, and we showed that we needed a very, very strategic approach to engage every possible candidate we could. And by showing that up front with data, doing our market mapping research and then providing the right level of accountability in our reports, we were able to get incredible buy-in from our hiring managers where they went on road shows, where they drove a lot of the outreach themselves, and they were able to build a second level of accountability in our own on behalf of campaigns by controlling their calendars, ultimately yielding to a huge amount of hires. Like we're talking 24, 25 senior hires in a period of 2 months, right? That wouldn't have been done if we didn't do a lot of the things before we got there.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think that being able to make sure that you have that foundation in place is just going to help things move so much more quickly. So that's great to hear that that approach really allowed you to make that many hires in such a short period of time. And one of the things that we've incorporated at Entelo is a send on behalf of feature, which is a great way to involve the hiring manager into the recruiting process without needing a lot of back and forth. So for anyone who's not familiar with that, it's a functionality that allows the recruiters to send an email from somebody like a hiring manager or a peer, say the VP of engineering, so that what the candidate receives is from the VP of engineering without the VP of engineering actually having to go in and do all that work. So it takes a lot of the workload off of the VP of engineering. The recruiter is able to move quickly. And so finding tips or technologies that allow the recruiter, once that buy-in has happened, to do some of that outreach and manage some of the steps without a lot of back and forth, I think is also really helpful in making sure that your hiring managers know that you're looking for ways to make their lives easier. And as long as you have that buy-in and foundational piece, they're going to trust you to move forward with that. And that actually goes back into our next tip, which is remaining transparent throughout the entire hiring process. And we've talked a little bit about that already. And if you followed the first tip, you're already having your regular check-ins as part of the cadence with your hiring managers. so that you're being upfront about any challenges and hopefully even before the meetings as things come up so that there's no surprises. And proactively letting hiring managers know about roadblocks or wins in an organized structure definitely helps build that credibility. So being able to be transparent at all points through the process, and then being able to back up your status updates with data. So I know that there's a lot of different data points that you can use, but Scott, I'd love to hear some of your feedback on metrics and what's been successful for you and Uber.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this could be a frustrating response, but I think in every case it depends. The one thing I note is what you see on this slide when it comes to presenting data around addressable market. This amount of candidates exist for this specific function, and response rates for outreach and conversion rates. These are what I call elementary metrics, right? This is the foundation. Like, these are must-haves. But if this is the information that you're providing to your hiring managers and the searches are incredibly hard, you're not actually providing value. Right? What you're providing is a baseline level of expectation, and you run a huge risk of creating a transactional recruiting relationship as opposed to a consultative recruiting relationship, right? The best recruiters that I've worked with, and what we try to stress on our teams is, let's go about 5 or 6 layers deeper into this data, right? If the addressable market is X, let's ask why, and let's ask why until we can't ask why anymore. Right. So one of the things that we did at Uber a couple of years ago was when we started looking at the conversion rates, we broke that up apart into very, very understandable ways, right? Like, how are we converting from a response rate to actually getting people on the phone? How are we converting that to a phone interview, to an on-site interview, and to an offer? And then a close. And by looking at the data, we started seeing some discrepancies that dug us in a little bit deeper. One of the things we realized was we had a huge issue with time in stage, right? We started seeing real discrepancies in conversion rates, and what we know is, well, a root cause of that is because people are actually staying in an on-site stage in our ATS for upwards of 21, 25 days. They're staying in an offer stage for upwards of 20 to 25 days, and that's unacceptable, right? I think we're all taught right away in recruiting that time kills all deals. And ultimately, what we're able to do from that data is, once again, ask why. Why are these things staying so long in stage? Ultimately, one thing we realized was that, you know what, this actually wasn't part of recruiting at all. We're an exponentially growing company, and the biggest issue here was we were running out of interview rooms. We were running out of interview capacity. We had engineers and product managers doing upwards of 7, 8 interviews a day, and they weren't getting their job done, right? Ultimately, by being able to align on the data and be able to dig really, really deep in the data, we were able to go back to our leadership and fix things from the top down on their side, because we were actually delivering. We were just delivering into a system that wasn't accommodated for the scale that we provided.
And I think that that's such an interesting point, that there are so many other components that factor into the recruiting process that might be less obvious, and really taking that consultant approach to ask why and what might be contributing to this that's less obvious is going to definitely help build that relationship of trust and get the buy-in when your hiring managers are seeing that you're thinking beyond just the next step and really looking at the bigger picture. And tying that into other things that might be going on with the organization, because there's always going to be plenty of challenges throughout the recruiting process. So seeing how you can mitigate some of those at the company level is going to be so impactful, where the hiring manager is looking at you and saying, okay, we're looking beyond just what might be in front of us as the next step to see where else we can create some other efficiencies. And one of the things that I think is always challenging, and it goes back to setting expectations, is defining what the ideal candidate looks like. So I think that can change over time, especially once you start the interview process and maybe the hiring manager had said, this is the profile I want, profile A, and then as they start interviewing, they're maybe seeing that be not exactly what they're looking for at the end of the day. Or even if they're saying, yes, I still want this profile, they keep saying no to different candidates that you're bringing with that background. So I'd love to hear about some of your experience there and how you handle those conversations.
Yeah, I think we've had some pretty interesting situations in the past. As you can imagine, with a company that grew from what was 2,000 to 20,000 in a period of less than 3 years, you'll have a lot of new managers, right? And new managers are learning the process with you. In one specific case, when we were building out some of our analytics functions, we had a hiring manager that, as we continued to calibrate, and this is probably a pretty common story to a lot of you, was kind of changing the requirements on a week by week basis. And so we would constantly need to intake over and over again. And during those intakes, we'd always find something new, right? Ultimately discrediting some of the intakes from the past. And so, one of the things that I like to do in an intake meeting in the beginning is, let's not worry about the role at all. Let's worry about the organization, right? Let's worry about what your charter is, what you're actually expected to build, what does success look like, and then underneath that, what's the current contents of your team, and how are they serving that function? When we get to that level of granularity and we say, okay, we do need a data analyst or a business analyst or a business systems analyst or a data engineer or a SQL engineer, we're able to really get to bottom line. Okay, what do we really need? Like, what's this person serving, and what does success look like for that person or that group of people, right? In having that conversation, we're much more likely to align on competencies. Oh, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yep,
Hi, Elizabeth. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear
I
me?
can. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I think I dropped off for a second. Did you lose me for a long time?
Nope, it was seamless from our end.
Oh, great. So yes, so once you're able to align on, from a charter standpoint, what we need, you're able to align on competencies that we can really assess for the position, right? So anytime there is a change in the sourcing process, anytime there is a change in calibration, now we can go back to addressable market. Right now we can go back to talent mapping and really, really educate on hiring managers of, hey, if you want to make this change, this is the trade-off, right? This is what you're going to see from a market, because we've already done a lot of the work, and theoretically we've already put a lot of effort into the roles to really show the throughput metrics, right? To really show how many candidates are in process and how they're converting based on the effort that the sourcing team or the recruiting team is actually putting in. Ultimately, what you can do at that point is you could take roles that have potentially been open for 6, 12, 18 months, right, and close them relatively quickly, because you're aligning on vision before you're aligning on the actual requirements.
Definitely. I think that makes so much sense to really keep that big picture in mind so that you can keep pointing back to, here's the ultimate outcome we want, rather than it feeling like just check boxes that you're trying to get through. And I know you mentioned data and being able to leverage that. So I want to go into our next tip, which is using data to transform yourself from a recruiter to a consultant. And I know you provided a few examples, but I'd love to get a little bit more information on just how valuable data is, and making sure that the hiring manager, you're working with them, like you said before, not just on the information, but what do you do with that in terms of next steps and making conscious decisions about how to move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I think data, it can be your most powerful tool as a recruiter, but it can also be your biggest enemy. It could be something that's so dangerous in keeping you from being the consultant you want to be, depending on your understanding of the root causes of the data that you present and how you present that data, right? So a perfect example is what you see on this slide, right? When you track metrics like this, a good example is when you track response rates, right? Now, at a beginner level, when I track response rates, and let's say I'm looking for back-end software engineers, I do about 150 reach outs a week, and I get about 30 responses. Thus, my response rate is 20%, right? Now, when you track that through conversion, and you're only making a specific amount of hires, say one hire every 2 months, it looks like something's broken there. And if in the absence of more data, what that tends to look like is, wow, this recruiter that's doing all this outreach is not very effective. They're not very persuasive. They're not getting candidates in the funnel, right? And that's why we've got to be able to be more polished in breaking down that data, right? If I've done 150 outreaches, well, 30 people have responded, but we're at an interesting point in the market where 12 or 13 of these candidates that have responded like aren't available for another 3 or 4 months. They're waiting for their cliffs to vest. They're waiting for bonus payouts to hit. Like they're just simply not interested in this process. And also another 5 or 6 actually don't want to work here. They haven't heard great things, and that's probably an opportunity for us to adjust on that. Right? Our true response rate or our interested response rate is actually probably closer to 10%. Right? And based on that 10%, we're converting really, really well. Right? 90% of those candidates are making it to phone interview, and those candidates that are making it to phone interview are converting at our standard conversion rates. So we've identified where the real gap is here, right? The real gap is we have another opportunity to engage candidates that we've already engaged but aren't really interested right now. We could do a better job of convincing earlier on the end. And Mr. or Miss Hiring Manager, this is your opportunity to do so. Perhaps this is when we do the on behalf of campaign, right? To engage the candidates that aren't as interested as we'd want them to be, right? Or perhaps this is the time for us to do something really, really outside of the box and really get in front of the candidates in a way that we haven't before.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that's one thing that Entelo, we've tried to do in looking at our product, but even how we like to recruit, and knowing the areas that are really important in terms of being able to have those conversations. And we have a couple product features. One is track, one is reporting, and tracking allows you to really track and analyze candidate communication right within the tool so that you can gauge the success of the outreach efforts and then report on that so that you're making sure that you're having that ongoing conversation, and that you can adjust as you need to, because we know that there's always going to be points in time where if there are things that are happening more broadly in the market, that you're keeping that in mind and that you're aware of that. So that's something that we definitely take into heart as we've looked at ways to empower recruiters with data, both from a tracking and a reporting side. And then the last tip, which is using the candidate experience as a metric for hiring manager and recruiting alignment. And we know that we're in a period of time where jobs are finding people rather than the other way around. So there's a lot of passive candidates that we need to be engaging with to make sure that we're finding the right people. So there are people who are not necessarily actively looking, and we know that throughout the candidate experience, there's different points where they might want to withdraw from the process just based on the experience itself. So I'd love to understand a little bit about how Uber looks at the candidate experience, especially when you're filling so many roles, and you also might be interviewing people who are also writers. So you're working in a consumer space where there might be folks who use Uber as well as might be applying to work there. So I'd love to get some of your feedback on just the candidate experience, making sure that it's great when you're managing so many open roles.
Yeah, I think that there's so many layers to candidate experience, obviously, but our perspective is this: it's like when a candidate has a poor candidate experience, typically what will happen is, well, that candidate won't want to work at Uber anymore, right? And there are huge ripple effects to that, right? That candidate has their own network, right? This becomes an employee brand issue. For Uber, this is twice as scary, right? Because we not only lose out on that candidate as a future candidate and affect that person's network, we also potentially lose out on a customer. We lose out on a rider, right? People like that cognitive connection between candidate and customer is so closely intertwined that it just affects us in so many different ways, right? So for us, we do a couple of things that we want to make sure are embedded in every step of the process. And it's actually not that different from what you've seen on this presentation. It ties to accountability and transparency, right? Like every candidate is important. We will get back to you in a certain amount of time. It'll be as soon as we can. We'll be as transparent as we can possibly be with you about what the process looks like, about what leveling looks like, about what the entire organization looks like, and other opportunities open to you. And we'll also be transparent with you about where you stand in the process. I think that's the first step, right? Now, as that gets closer and closer and closer to the finish line, as that gets closer and closer into we want to give you an offer and we want to make it impossible for you to sign the offer, it's up to us to build those levels of connection. And those levels of connection don't come from the recruiter. All the recruiter can be is transparent and accountable. What that recruiter needs to do is facilitate strong connections between that candidate and the hiring team, those individual contributors and leaders on that team, with that hiring manager and with leaders within the organizations. And we've done a lot of cool things here, including giving out swag boxes arriving in an Uber at the moment someone's received an offer or a week after they received the offer, hosting VIP dinners with people levels and levels above to show that level of love for the candidate. Or just simply, snapping a Polaroid of the entire team saying, we look forward to working with you, Elizabeth, right? And I think, if you build the accountability and you build the trust early on, those things really, really hit home. And you can really actually track that and how that affects conversion rates and close rates later on.
Absolutely. And I love what you said about doing things like taking a Polaroid and sending it to the candidate. Just those little touches really make people feel like there's that investment from the company and from the recruiting team that is exciting for them and gives them the enthusiasm to feel excited about accepting the role. So I know that we're a little bit over time. Thanks for everybody who stayed on. I'm going to turn it back over to our moderator.
Hi all. I know I did say that we would be answering questions at the close of this webinar. Unfortunately, we have rounded down to our time here. So please look out for a blog post coming from the Entelo blog answering the questions from this webinar. I'll be sure to get your questions to both Elizabeth and Scott to get your answers to you. Thank you all again for joining, and I hope that you learned a lot about how to manage your hiring manager relationships. Thank you so much, Scott and Elizabeth. Loved all the insights shared, and thank you everyone again for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.